Let me take a sip from my cup of tea, and I will tell you what happened 2 years back with me.
They told me I was too fragile to travel. It came not as a sermon, but as a checklist, blanket statements folded neatly into concern. Too old for long flights, Grandma. Just watch the house. You shouldn't be alone in big crowds. The doctors said to avoid long trips. They said it like it softened the shape of their absence, like an excuse could be a cushion. They said it, and the words slid over me, polite as rain. I heard it in the kitchen, a weekday afternoon when the sun still had the patience to sit on the table. Jody placed the brochure on the counter as if it were proof, as if paper could be a substitute for what they would not say. They had booked seats for the family, 3 rows, 2 window seats, laughter already printed on the itinerary. A photograph of blue water and white stairs. My name was nowhere on it. I folded my dish towel and folded my hands on top of it. I did not call him a coward. I did not call her thoughtless. I made tea, 1 small pot, and poured 2 cups, 1 for me and 1 left cooling on the counter out of force of habit. For half an hour, the house kept its usual small noises, the radiator's faint tick, the refrigerator humming a ballad of bulbs and coils, the neighbor's radio through the thin wall. I listened as if listening might mend the thing that had been said. They think they know the map of me. They think age is a longitude you cross and never return. But age is not a line. It is weather. Sometimes it rains. Sometimes it holds. Sometimes you find yourself unlikely as a sunny day in the middle of winter. That night I opened the drawer where I keep the things that have most often made decisions for me. A passport. A small leather notebook with train times written in the back. A slim envelope with a boarding pass taped inside from 60 years ago. I traced the lines of the passport as if by touch I could feel the places it remembered. There was a photograph of my husband tucked into the back page. Paul, angled like he'd been surprised mid-laugh, that same tilt that made me marry him once. I pressed my thumb to his face until the smudge of memory softened. I did not call the travel agent. I did not email or confront or explain. I made a plan that would require no one's approval. It is possible, the world persists in this way, that a woman can arrange her leaving with the economy of a secret handshake. A telephone number dialed in the small hours, a one-way ticket bought to nowhere with a methodical hand, a suitcase that contains less about departure than about return. I chose the train because trains do not demand your vanity. A plane makes you prove yourself at every gate, dress neatly, smile, confirm that the world has not yet eroded you. A train is simpler, platforms with the smell of coal and coffee, seats that have worn the shape of many backs before yours, the slow indulgence of landscapes that do not hurry to be beautiful. I booked a seat by the window because windows have always been faithful. They frame what the world offers without asking for permission. The morning I left, I wore the navy dress I had worn to Paul's funeral. It still fit, not because of tailoring, but because memory makes soft spaces, fabric stretched across bones whose shape the years had learned. I tied on a scarf with small blue flowers. The scarf was Paul's. He saved the prints from fabrics he liked and used to whisper, "It'll look good on you," as if he could see into mornings I had not yet lived. I locked the door behind me without a ceremony. There was a half-finished crossword on the table and a cup with lipstick on its rim. I left a note for Carol, my neighbor, asking only that she water the plants and close the curtains. "Going for a short trip," I wrote, which was not untrue. The trip would be short in one sense and very long in another. The platform smelled of wet stone and machine oil. People moved with inevitable purpose, children dragging backpacks, a man on a bicycle arguing into his phone, a young woman in a coat that had been pressed to an unreasonable stiffness. No one noticed me beyond the polite nod given to old women in public spaces. I preferred it that way. If you are invisible, you do not have to explain yourself. People could rest a tea tin between their knees. There was a young man across the aisle who read the way people sometimes learned, obsessively, as if words could be counted and measured. He had a paper bag on his lap and a studied absentness that made him a good companion. At the next stop, an elderly woman with a hat that looked like a small boat took the seat beside me. She smelled faintly of camphor and lavender. We did not talk at once. We are taught that silence is a sign of brooding. Sometimes it is only the setting sun. The train began to move with the usual reluctance. The city peeled away in thin stripes of brick and glass, and then the flats gave way to green. The green looked like an argument the years were having with themselves. Roof lines blurred. A boy on his bicycle waved to someone in a yard, and then was gone like a swallowed wave. I watched everything as if it were a film, which perhaps it was, the kind of film no one made anymore about women of a certain age discovering their own story. We stopped at small towns. People got on with baskets and umbrellas and chatter that smelled of bread. I read the names of the stations like a litany: Langley, Harrow, Welling, Welling. Each name was a small consolation. I unfolded my notebook and with careful handwriting wrote the name of the town, the time, what I'd eaten on the train. It was a small record that might later be evidence. I had not gone because I was angry or because I wanted to hurt anyone. I had gone because I wanted to remember how to be surprised. At one stop, a boy of about 8 peered into my window, his face pressed to the glass with the immodesty of youth. He grinned at me and mouthed the word grandma like it was a shared joke across the pane. I smiled back, which made his confusion visible. Did he even have a grandmother on his ticket to hold? The conductor checked our passes and nodded, as if making sure we all existed in the same ledger of place and time. Conversations on trains are often small rebellions. You meet someone whose life is not yours, and you get to borrow 2 hours of their attention without the social penalty of obligation. The elderly woman with the hat told me about a cat she had lost in 1994. The young man showed me a photograph on his phone of a dog with a twisted ear. He told me about his wedding, planned for next summer, the way I had once told someone a story about a wedding, and it came back to me soft as an echo. We stitched little patches into one another's listening. I thought of the brochure on my kitchen counter, the one that had announced their joy with glossy teeth. I thought of the way the family chat would stall and then flicker into life. Photographs of beaches, cliff edges, the perfect curve of somebody else's day. They had left me a ticket, priced in assumptions. The train took us over a river whose water looked old enough to have stories in its current. Somewhere between county lines, the young man stood and stretched with the slow elegance of someone who had not yet learned how to carry regrets. He offered me his hand as he passed, a small courtesy of the present. I held it for a breath, a brief acknowledgement of the company of strangers, and then watched the line of trees move like applause. I did not have a destination in my pocket. I had maps, a loose plan of towns and pauses. I had no itinerary stamped with family names. I had the important thing, a window and the straight line of the tracks. The tracks, I thought, were honest. They do not pretend to be anything but the path they are. By the time the sky had thinned into the pale color of old paper, the train slowed for a station that was small and had a name I liked, Edenbridge. It seemed an absurdly hopeful name, and perhaps that was why I chose to get off there. Perhaps because hope is sometimes a practical decision, a luggage tag, a purchased map, a place to begin. I looked at my reflection in the glass, my face made softer by the light. I could still see Paul's slant of a smile tucked into my cheekbones. I stepped down onto the platform with the slow, careful gait of someone who had learned to measure her steps. The air smelled of rain and frying batter. A woman in a red coat waved at someone across the street and laughed as if she had invented joy. I took my small suitcase and my scarf and walked toward the town with the kind of hope that does not demand miracles, only possibility. There are moments when you decide to change the shape of a life, and all you have are small practical movements: buying a ticket, winding a scarf twice, choosing a suitcase that zips all the way round. I had done them. I had not shouted or protested. I had only moved like the train, steadily, as if the body itself was a vehicle, and I had finally allowed it to run. I did not yet know what would happen next. There is a certain deliciousness in that. It is the same sensation you get when you open an old drawer and find a photograph you did not remember, the edges folded like a secret. I walked toward the town, toward a bed and breakfast with lace curtains, and a woman behind the counter whose hands had the same small, efficient movements as mine, whose eyes did not know my name but whose kindness was immediate. I left the platform thinking of windows, how they hold a world and let you move through it, how they let light find the shape of a face and make it possible to stand. I had taken my seat by the window, and in doing so had decided not to be a story only they told about me. The woman at the counter introduced herself as Marta, though everyone in town called her Mart. Her hands moved the way hands do when they have learned the exact economy of small tasks. Key turned, ledger flipped, teacup set on a saucer as if the saucer were a small altar. She spoke with a soft consonant that rounded into vowels like fruit. "Welcome to the Willow and Wren," she said, and it sounded less like an advertisement and more like an offering. My room had lace curtains and a lamp that threw a pool of light, small and generous, on the bedside table. The bed was not kingly, but it had a quilt folded at the foot with the kind of pattern that suggested 100 hands had smoothed it at least once. I placed my small suitcase on the chair and, on impulse, opened the window. The evening air smelled of frying batter and wet wood, and somewhere down the lane, someone played a radio with a distant, tinkling song. It felt like coming home to a house I had never lived in. Marta asked if I wanted dinner in the dining room. The question contained no undertow. There was no expectation that an old woman traveling alone should be patted on the head and pitied. I said yes. We sat at a long table whose surface bore the soft scars of many meals. The other guests were a scatter of faces, a couple in their 30s speaking softly about a new business, a man who smelled faintly of tobacco and had the posture of someone who had known long landscapes, and a woman wearing a cardigan with a fox embroidered on the pocket. We ate thin slices of roast and a pudding that tasted of lemon and thyme. Conversation at the table moved like a stream. People offered fragments of themselves and left the rest to sediment. The man with the tobacco told a story about a bridge that had once collapsed and how the town had repaired it together. The couple argued about planting dates for tomatoes. The woman with the fox cardigan spoke up about a volunteer reading program for children and the stubbornness of small minds. No one asked why I was there. That was a small kindness I appreciated. Often, when you are visible, people feel obliged to fill the silence with questions. Here, the silence was a courteous guest. After dinner, Marta walked me to my room. "You come from far away," she said, and for a second her voice held an odd curiosity, not of scandal, but of honest wonder. "You must have a story." I thought of saying that everyone does, and then felt ridiculous for answering, as if stories were reasons you packed a bag. Instead, I said, I like trains. It wasn't a lie. Trains gave me the right motion. You could leave, and if you wished, come back with proofs. She left me with a candle on the dresser and a small ceramic dish of lavender. I sat on the bed and thought of the family chat flashing on the phone in my pocket like a dim, uninvited candle. I had left it switched off when I boarded. It seemed proper to let the night arrive without other people's photos between me and the world. The first night in a new place brings with it a peculiar hunger, not precisely for food, but for orientation. I opened the drawer and found a pen and some postcards. I took one and wrote, not to anyone in particular, but as a way to make the night explain itself. The postcard said simply, Edenbridge, Willow and Wren. The town smells of frying batter and something softer. I am here. I left the card blank on the bedside table as a kind of bookmark of my existence. Sleep came slow at first, the way memories settle into a drawer. Then, in the thin hours before dawn, I woke to the sound of someone knocking at my door as if they were checking whether the house still had a pulse. I opened it to find the woman with the fox cardigan standing there with a paper bag and a look of exaggerated embarrassment. "I'm Nora," she said. "I'm sorry to intrude, but I thought you might like some tea before you set off." Her voice was small and practical. She turned the bag in her hands like she was weighing explanation with courtesy. "I bake too much. This one is lemon drizzle. It keeps well." I invited her in. We sat on the edge of the bed with tea in mismatched cups and slices of cake that tasted of sugar and a shy pride. She spoke of small things, of a bridge oversaw in the spring, of a book group that had recently read Angela Carter and argued about endings, of a grandson who had learned to whistle a particular tune. There was nothing dramatic in her life, no absconding husbands, no sudden inheritances, only the slow accumulation of days that made a character. Her presence felt like a seam finely stitched, functional, honest, warm. "You'll want to walk the lanes tomorrow," she said. "There's a shop that keeps odd hours, and a bookshop where the owner will let you swap a book for a story." She hesitated. "If you like stories." She said it in a way that made it possible to refuse without shame. I told Maura about the train, about the window seat as a decision. I told her how the family had booked seaside seats and had left a blank where my name might have been. She nodded, not with the expression of someone interested in gossip, but with the slow nod of someone respecting grief, disguised as action. "Sometimes not being invited is the first thing that frees you," she said. "It's as if someone unclenches their jaw and you feel the air in a new way." We walked in the morning, but not at once. There is a small art to waiting until the day pulls itself together. Later, with a map folded in my hand and the sun not yet hot, I walked the town more carefully than a tourist. Edenbridge is small enough to be intimate without being claustrophobic. There was a lane where laundry swung like quiet flags, a square where an old bench carved with initials had warm rounded corners like a well-loved jaw. The bookshop was narrow, stacked so high with volumes, its ceiling seemed to dip from the weight of stories. The owner, a thin man named Arthur with a sweater deposited in 1,000 patches, looked up and smiled, as if he had been expecting someone exactly like me. "You can swap a book for a story," he said without preface, as if this was a normal municipal function. "Leave your book and tell me something, anything, and I'll tell you about the person who last held that volume." He had the air of someone who thought of words as currency. I handed him a thin novel I had carried for years, the spine cracked like the smile of an old friend. "It's not much," I said. He shrugged and nodded. I told him a little thing, how I once taught a boy to read by letting him chew on the corner of the page when he was nervous. He listened, as if he had heard a root being watered. Then, as promised, he told me who had last held the book. A woman who used to come in and borrow travel guides and never returned them. Who had, as Arthur softly suggested, perhaps been saving them for a life she thought she would someday take. That afternoon, I sat on a bench with the book and thought about travel guides hoarded like talismans. I thought of the brochures at home, glossy and confident, and of the way people use rules to excuse the shape of their absence. On the bench, under the watch of a town that had no opinion about me, I let a small plan bloom into something that felt like courage. I would keep going. I would not turn this trip into a proof for others. I would let it be, quite simply, for me. Courage often arrives in small increments: a cup of tea accepted, a postcard written, a book swapped for a story. It was not the sweeping Hollywood kind of decision I had once imagined when I was younger and thought decisions should look like fireworks. It was a slow, approving hum that began at the base of the throat and settled into the hands. That night, back at the Willow and Wren, I sat by the window and wrote a letter I would not send yet. I wrote about the man with the tobacco who fixed bridges, about the train's motion that felt like a safe, honest lie, about the woman who gave me a slice of lemon drizzle cake in the middle of the night. I did not write about them to explain myself to anyone. I wrote so that when I later questioned whether I had been brave, I would have a small archive of proof. Tomorrow, I decided I would venture further. There was a coast not far away, a place the locals called the Gray Shelf, with cliffs that looked like stacked books. Nora thought it worth the half-day, and Arthur said a ferry sometimes left at odd hours for places that were not on the map. The idea of a shore held a particular gravity. Water makes edges obvious. Perhaps a shore would tell me where the line sat between the life I had worn and the one I might yet fit. I went to bed feeling oddly unafraid, not because everything had been solved, but because the world, for the first time in a long while, seemed willing to let me choose the map. The window beside my bed framed the sky like a promise, not a demand for performance, only an allowance to look up. The morning came quietly, the kind of morning that hesitates before becoming day. Light moved slowly along the wall, soft as a memory deciding whether to stay. I woke before the bell rang for breakfast and lay for a while, listening to the sound of someone down the hall running water into a basin. The walls here seemed to breathe, each sigh, each creak of timber, an old habit of the house. I dressed in a sweater I'd nearly left behind, soft gray with a single loose thread near the cuff, and packed my notebook, a pen, and the small map Nora had drawn for me. "Follow the lane past the bakery," she'd said, "and when you think you've gone too far, you're almost there." The bakery's window was fogged with sugar and breath. Inside, a boy barely 20 arranged loaves with the solemnity of someone handling relics. I bought a roll warm enough to burn my fingers and ate it on the street, each bite tasting faintly of salt and butter and the kind of care you don't notice until it's missing. At the edge of town, the road narrowed into a ribbon of gravel, bordered by hedges that hummed with bees. Beyond them, fields stretched into an easy green that looked newly washed. The air carried the scent of wet grass and diesel from a distant tractor. I walked until the sound of the town had thinned behind me, replaced by the low, steady rhythm of my shoes on earth. The Gray Shelf wasn't a tourist spot. It was the kind of place locals mentioned without directions, as if you were meant to find it only when you'd earned it. The path wound through a small wood where light dripped in golden beads between the leaves. When the trees opened, the world widened. The cliffs rose ahead, pale stone veined with darker seams, the sea below restless and deliberate. I stood for a long time on the edge, far enough back to feel safe, close enough to taste salt on the wind. The water wasn't blue. It was a shifting mirror of grays and greens, like moods layered one over the other. I thought of the photographs my family would send from their beach, bright parasols, impossible turquoise, the performance of happiness. Their sea would be loud with laughter and engine hum. Mine was quiet, stubbornly itself. A man stood further down the path, painting. He wore a wide hat and a coat that looked too heavy for the weather. His easel leaned slightly against the wind, the canvas stippled with damp air. I watched him for a while before he turned, sensing the weight of eyes. "Morning," he said. His voice was low and a little hoarse, as though unused. "It is," I answered. "Sea's fickle today. It usually is." He smiled at that, small, approving. "You're not from here." "No." He nodded toward the cliffs. "They change every hour. Can't paint them the same twice." "I've been trying for 30 years. That sounds like faith," I said. He laughed, not loudly, but with a kind of soft surrender. "Or foolishness. Hard to tell the difference anymore." He returned to his canvas. I stood behind him, watching the way his hand hesitated before each stroke, as if asking permission from the world. "What do you do with them?" I asked. "Mostly store them. Some people buy one now and then. I paint them to remember what light feels like on skin." His answer stayed with me. Light on skin. I remembered afternoons in the backyard, hanging laundry, the way sunlight clung to the cotton and warmed my arms. Ordinary holiness. I wondered how many small miracles I'd missed while waiting for grand ones. After a while, he looked at me again. "You're traveling alone?" "Yes." "Good," he said simply. And that was all. We didn't speak again, but when I left, he lifted his brush in a small salute. It felt like benediction. I followed the path down to a small cove. The tide had left a scatter of shells and dark ribbons of kelp. I sat on a rock and pulled my notebook from my bag. The wind flicked the pages until I pinned one down with my hand. I wrote without thinking much. The sea is not kind or cruel. It simply is. Maybe that's what peace is, accepting that the world doesn't owe you tenderness and still finding it where you can. When I looked up, a gull wheeled low over the water and screamed, a sound so human in its loneliness that it startled me. I realized then how long it had been since I'd spoken to anyone who didn't expect something in return. The walk back took longer. The wind had shifted, carrying the scent of coming rain. By the time I reached town, clouds had gathered low, heavy with unspent thought. Marta met me at the door of the inn. "You look like you've been somewhere," she said, handing me a towel before I'd asked. "I suppose I have," she smiled. "The sea keeps secrets well. Dinner's in an hour if you want it. Nora's already here." Dinner was stew, rich and dark, served in bowls that steamed up our faces. Nora waved me over. "You found it," she said, without needing to ask where. I did. "And it's honest," I said. She seemed to like that answer. After dinner, she handed me an envelope, its paper slightly crinkled. "You left this on your table last night." She said, "Your postcard." I'd forgotten it entirely. I turned it over in my hands. The blank back of it looked newly important. I found a pen and, without much thought, wrote an address, my granddaughter's. Then, beneath the words I'd already written, I added, "Don't let them tell you where you can go. The world is still wide." I sealed it and handed it to Marta for posting in the morning. That night, as rain began to trace soft lines against the window, I lay awake and listened. Somewhere outside, water ran from gutters into the earth, a steady hush. I thought of the man on the cliff, of the brush hovering before the stroke, of Nora's quiet certainty. I thought of Paul, too, how he'd once told me that a journey is just a conversation with the self, if you listen closely enough. I had begun to listen. Tomorrow, I decided, I would go further, perhaps catch that ferry Arthur had mentioned, the one that left at odd hours for places not on maps. Somewhere small, somewhere where no one would think to look for me, not because I was hiding, but because I was finally free to be found by something new. I closed my eyes to the rhythm of rain, the sound of distant laughter from the dining room below, and the steady heartbeat of the world moving on without needing permission. The morning was mist, not the kind that sits politely on the horizon, but the kind that swallows the world in a hush so complete it feels holy. From the window of my room, Edenbridge looked like a half-erased painting, only rooftops and lampposts surviving in outline. Somewhere, a church bell rang, its sound bending through the fog until it seemed to come from inside my chest. Marta had left a note with my breakfast tray. Ferry leaves from Langmouth Wharf. Ask for Etta. She doesn't advertise, but she'll know what you mean. A ferry that didn't advertise, of course. I finished my tea and packed my small bag. Nora caught me in the hallway as I was leaving. Off somewhere? Langmouth, I said. There's a ferry. She smiled, but her eyes narrowed in concern. There's always a ferry, she said, but make sure you come back. I will, I lied gently. Langmouth was 15 miles and a lifetime away. The road there wound through low fields where the fog hugged the hedges like it had secrets to keep. The bus I caught smelled of rain-soaked upholstery and old newspapers. Only 2 other passengers rode with me, a woman knitting something the color of bruised plums, and a man asleep with his head tilted against the window, mouth slightly open, the posture of someone who has spent too long being tired. When the bus stopped, the driver called out, "Langmouth Wharf," and looked at me as if to make sure someone heard. The wharf wasn't really a harbor, more a splintered dock attached to a pub that looked permanently on the verge of closing. I found her there, Etta, exactly as Marta's note had promised. She was shorter than I expected, wrapped in a navy coat several sizes too big, and her hair, gray streaked with white, was tied back with a red ribbon that refused to stay tied. She was oil and salt and cigarette smoke, and when she spoke, it sounded like gravel being rained on. "You're the one looking for the ferry?" "Yes." "Where to?" "Anywhere it goes." She grinned. "That's a dangerous kind of answer." The ferry was little more than a boat, a long, narrow thing that groaned when you stepped aboard. The paint was peeling in layers like the memory of better years. A wooden sign on the rail read, "The Mercy Jane," its letters faded to ghosts. I liked it immediately. There were only 3 of us that morning, Etta, myself, and a man in a brown jacket carrying a camera, older than both of us combined. He nodded once politely, then went back to adjusting the lens, as if the fog were something that could be persuaded to pose. "Where does this go?" I asked. Etta shrugged. "Depends on the tide. Sometimes to the island, sometimes to the headland. The sea decides, not me." "Do people live there?" "Used to. Now it's just gulls and a lighthouse no one keeps." The boat moved as though reluctant, pushing itself through the white water in slow sighs. I sat near the rail and watched the world dissolve. The fog folded over us, thick and forgiving. It smelled of metal and rain and something faintly sweet, kelp or decay. It was hard to tell the difference. Etta steered with the confidence of someone who trusted no one but the elements. "You don't talk much," she said. "I've done enough talking for several lifetimes." She barked a laugh. "Good. Talking makes people forget to look." The man with the camera lifted it to his eye. Click. The sound was sharp, a small act of defiance against the muffled air. He caught me looking and smiled. "The light's strange today," he said. "You can't tell where the sky ends." Maybe that's the point. Maybe. Some places are better when they don't have edges. I liked him for that. He didn't ask the usual questions, my name, my age, why I was there. He took a few more photographs, then sat beside me, camera resting on his knees. "I'm Samuel," he said after a while. "Used to be a journalist. Gave it up when words started sounding like noise." I smiled. "Maybe that's why I took the train." "You running away?" "Running toward, I hope." He nodded as though that were a legitimate destination. The fog began to thin around midday. The shape of an island emerged, low cliffs, a scatter of stone cottages, and a single spire that broke the horizon like a finger pointing nowhere. Etta cut the engine. "End of the line," she said. "If the tide behaves, I'll be back before night." "And if it doesn't?" I asked. She grinned. "Then you'll have a story." Samuel and I stepped onto the small wooden jetty. The planks were slick, the air sharper now that the sun had begun to pry at the mist. The island felt abandoned, but not lonely, as if it had simply grown tired of explaining itself to people. A narrow path led up the hill toward the lighthouse. We walked without agreement, side by side in companionable quiet. Seagulls wheeled overhead, their cries stitched into the wind. Halfway up, Samuel stopped and looked back at the shrinking ferry. "You ever think about how easy it is to disappear?" "Often," I said. "I think that's what makes staying remarkable." At the top of the hill, the lighthouse stood like a giant's bone, weathered and pale. Its door was open. Inside, the air was cool and still, smelling faintly of rust and salt. The stairs spiraled upward, each step echoing like the sound of time turning on itself. We climbed without speaking until we reached the lantern room. The glass panes were cracked in places, the great lens dusty but intact. From up there, the sea stretched endlessly, silver, soft, and indifferent. Samuel took a photograph, and then another. "You ever miss the people you left?" he asked quietly. "Sometimes," I said. "But missing them doesn't mean I want to return." He nodded, lowering the camera. "I know that feeling." For a while, neither of us spoke. The only sound was the slow rhythm of waves hitting rock. I thought of my family's beach, the noise, the brightness, the laughter that excluded as much as it shared. This silence was better. It felt like permission. "I used to write about people who were running away," he said finally. "War zones, exiles, migrants. I thought I understood them. Turns out I was just describing myself." "Do you miss it?" "No. Words can lie, but photographs—" He tapped the camera gently. "They only tell you what's there, not what you wanted to see." I looked out at the sea. "Maybe that's why I prefer windows. They show you the world, but they don't promise you'll belong to it." He smiled, and for a moment we were two people suspended outside time, the light bending through the glass and wrapping us in the same soft glare. We stayed until late afternoon, until the fog began to gather again in thin ribbons across the water. From the top of the lighthouse, I saw Etta's ferry approaching, a small shape cutting through the gray. I felt something tighten in my chest, not dread exactly, but the ache of leaving a place you hadn't realized had claimed you. On the way back down, Samuel handed me a small photograph. It was of the sea, nothing else. No horizon, no land, just water caught mid-breath. "A keepsake," he said, "for when you forget how wide the world really is." "Do you give these to everyone?" "Only to those who look like they might understand." When we reached the ferry, Etta was already untying the ropes. "Find what you were looking for?" she asked. "Not yet," I said, "but I think I'm close." She chuckled. "That's better than most." As the boat pulled away, the island dissolved once more into mist. I held the photograph in my hand, the paper damp from sea spray, and thought of how strange it was that something so fleeting could feel like evidence. The sea carried us back slowly, the horizon folding and unfolding like breath. And for the first time in years, I didn't feel like I was being carried away from something. I felt like I was being carried toward it, whatever it was. The ferry groaned against the dock, and I stepped back onto the mainland as if returning from a dream that hadn't decided whether to let me go. The mist was thinner now, receding like an exhausted secret. Samuel stayed behind to speak with Etta, gesturing toward the horizon, perhaps already framing another photograph in his mind. I wanted to thank him, but gratitude felt premature. Some meetings are not meant to end with punctuation. They linger like ellipses. By the time I reached the bus stop, the air had begun to smell of earth again. The rain from earlier in the week had coaxed small white flowers out of the ditches, the kind that bloom without permission. I caught the afternoon bus to Edenbridge, the same driver behind the wheel. He nodded once when he saw me, neither surprised nor curious, just the quiet acknowledgement people offer each other when they share a small, stubborn routine. The town unfolded slowly through the window, familiar yet subtly altered, as if my eyes had been recalibrated by the sea. Even the cobblestones seemed to have learned a new language. When I walked into the Willow and Wren, Marta looked up from polishing a glass and smiled in that way she did, like she was genuinely relieved to see that the world hadn't misplaced me. "You made it back," she said. "I did. Etta's ferries don't always return the same day. Thought we'd have to start sending search parties." I had faith, I said, and we both knew that wasn't entirely true. She handed me an envelope before I could ask for my key. "This came for you. No return address, but it smells faintly of guilt and expensive perfume." I turned it over in my hand. The handwriting was unmistakable, my daughter's, precise, practiced, slanted like a woman who spent her life writing on to-do lists and appointment reminders. I took it upstairs before opening it, unsure whether I was ready to invite the past into the same room as the sea. The letter was short, more apology by implication than by admission. "Mum, we realized too late that we should have asked if you wanted to come. It wasn't meant to exclude you. It was just logistics. The flights, the stairs at the villa, you know how you get tired. Anyway, we missed you. I hope you're not cross. Maybe we can plan something smaller next time. Just us. Love, Jody." I read it twice. It was the kind of letter that thought itself kind. I could almost hear her voice, careful, managerial, full of the soft diplomacy of someone who's learned to apologize without changing. I folded it neatly and slid it beneath the photograph Samuel had given me, a makeshift paperweight of forgiveness I hadn't yet earned. There was a knock at the door. It was Nora, holding a tray with tea and something warm beneath a napkin. "You look like someone deciding whether to burn a letter or frame it," she said. Both options occurred to me. She set the tray down and poured us each a cup. "You went somewhere important. I can tell by the way you're looking at the walls." "I went to sea," I said. She nodded. "The sea's a mirror. Sometimes it shows you yourself before you're ready." We drank in silence for a while. The cake under the napkin was apple, soft and fragrant, with sugar crusted along the top. I told her about Etta, about the island and the lighthouse, about Samuel and his camera. She listened without interruption, her hands folded around the teacup like she was warming an idea. When I mentioned the photograph, she leaned forward. "May I see it?" I handed it to her. She studied it closely, tracing the outline of the waves with her finger. "No horizon," she said. "That's brave. People don't like pictures without edges." "Maybe I don't either," I said quietly. "Then maybe that's what you needed to learn." Before she left, Nora put a hand on my shoulder. "You should go back," she said, "to the island. To wherever you felt something that wasn't measured by someone else's clock. That night I went for a walk through town. The lamps were lit, and their light pooled on the cobblestones like small promises. Shops were closing, the florist pulling in her buckets, the butcher flipping his sign to closed. I passed the bookshop. Its window glowed faintly, the shelves casting long, patient shadows. Through the glass I saw Arthur at the counter, reading under a single lamp. When he looked up and caught my reflection, he waved me in. "Back from your adventure?" he asked. "Something like that." He reached beneath the counter and pulled out a book wrapped in brown paper. "Someone left this for you. Said you'd understand." I frowned. "Who?" "Didn't give a name. Tall man, carried an old camera, left yesterday." I unwrapped the paper carefully. Inside was a thin journal bound in blue cloth. The first page held a single photograph. Mine. Not a portrait exactly, but my reflection in the ferry window, half obscured by light and fog. Beneath it, in Samuel's handwriting, was a note. "For the woman who taught me that running away and arriving can be the same thing. S." There were no other pages filled. The rest of the book was blank, waiting. I closed it and held it against my chest for a moment, as if trying to steady something fluttering inside. Arthur smiled. "Looks like a journal. Maybe he thinks you should start writing." "Maybe he's right," I said. When I returned to the inn, Marta was in the lounge, wiping down the bar with deliberate slowness. "I saw you at the window just now," she said. "You had that look people get when they remember something important." "Perhaps I did." "Don't forget it again," she said softly. "The world's got enough people sleepwalking." I went up to my room and opened the window. The air was cooler tonight, scented with damp leaves and chimney smoke. Below, the street hummed faintly with the laughter of people heading home. I took the blue journal from my bag, opened to the first blank page, and began to write, not for them, not even for Samuel, but for the version of myself that had waited too long by other people's doors. I wrote about the train, the window seat, the sea, the island, the sound of gulls, the silence that didn't need explanation. I wrote until the words blurred into one another, and my hand began to ache. Then I set down the pen and read the lines back quietly, the way one might read a prayer. Outside, the mist had returned, but this time it felt different, less like an erasure, more like a beginning. I woke to birdsong and the clink of dishes downstairs. The clock on the nightstand said 7:30, though the light was soft enough to belong to dawn. The window was still open from last night. A curtain fluttered in and out like the slow breathing of the room. The air smelled faintly of bread, Marta's doing, no doubt, and the promise of a day that wasn't in a hurry to become anything yet. It had been 2 weeks since I first arrived in Edenbridge. At least that's what the calendar said, but days here didn't move in straight lines. They folded over each other, repeating small gestures until time itself seemed to loosen. Tea at breakfast, a walk to the square, a few hours of reading in the bookshop, dinner with Nora, and whatever story she'd decided the evening needed. I had not planned to stay. Staying had been something that happened to me before, circumstance, not choice. But here, staying felt earned. I'd paid for it with small bravery, the act of leaving, the act of returning. That morning I sat at my usual table by the window in the dining room. Marta placed a plate of eggs and toast before me without asking what I wanted. "You're predictable," she said, smiling. "That's not always bad." "I suppose it depends what you predict," I replied. "True enough." She poured the tea and leaned on the back of the chair opposite me. "Arthur says you've been writing." I nodded. "Every day." "Good," she said simply, as if that alone proved something worthwhile. "It suits you, the quiet. You look steadier." Steady. It had been years since anyone had used that word about me. My family's vocabulary for me had shifted over time, first reliable, then frail, then delicate. Steady was something new. It sounded like a choice. After breakfast, I walked to the square. The bookshop was open early, its bell jangling a greeting. Arthur looked up from the counter, spectacles perched halfway down his nose. "You've become part of the furniture," he said. "Doesn't everyone eventually? Not the right kind of furniture. You're more like the lamp no one noticed was missing until it's gone." I smiled. "You always did have a way with words." He shrugged. "Books rub off on you after a while. What'll it be today?" "I'll trade you a story." "Go on, then." I told him about the letter from Jody, about how guilt can sound like love when you write it neatly enough. He listened quietly, the way people do when they've outlived the need to fix other people's pain. When I finished, he reached behind him and handed me a small notebook with a red cover. "For your next chapter," he said, "everyone needs a sequel." By noon, the town was bustling. A market had sprung up in the square, stalls of wildflowers, jars of honey, paper-wrapped bread. Nora waved from the other side, holding a basket that looked too big for her arm. "You missed the good cheese," she called. "I'm here for the conversation," I said. "Then you'll go home empty-handed." She walked me to a stall selling old postcards, edges curled, handwriting fading into the sepia of memory. I picked one up at random. It showed a seaside pier and a date from 1963. The message on the back read, "The weather is merciful. Wish you were here, but maybe you are." The words were ordinary, yet they landed somewhere deep. I bought it for 50 pence and slipped it into my pocket. Back at the inn, I sat on the porch steps with my tea. The day hummed softly around me, bees in the garden, a cart rattling past on the street. I opened the red notebook Arthur had given me, wrote the date, and then without planning to, wrote, "I am not lost. I am simply somewhere no one thought to look." It felt like the truest thing I'd written yet. The sound of footsteps pulled me from the page. I looked up, and there he was. Samuel stood at the gate, camera slung over his shoulder, a satchel hanging loose at his side. His hair was wind-ruffled, his coat flecked with salt. For a moment, I thought I'd imagined him, some apparition from the island conjured by wishful thinking. But then he smiled, that quiet, self-conscious smile that begins with the eyes and ends in surrender. "May I come in?" he asked. "You already have," I said, moving aside. He joined me on the steps, setting his camera down between us. "I wasn't sure I'd find you still here. I wasn't sure I'd be either. I came back for something I forgot," he said, looking out at the garden. "What was that?" He turned to me then. "A conversation, the one we didn't finish." We sat in silence for a while. The sun had begun its slow descent, turning the air the color of honey. He took a photograph, just one, of the garden. Then he said, "There's an exhibition in Brighton next month. Photographs of the coast, of people who wander near the edge. I'd like to include you." "Include me?" "The photograph from the ferry window, it's not just yours, you know. It's something else now. It's truth." I hesitated. The thought of my face, or the suggestion of it, hanging on a gallery wall felt intrusive. But there was a tenderness in the way he said it, as though he were offering not exposure, but remembrance. "What if I say no?" I asked. "Then it stays between us," he said. "Some truths don't need an audience." "And if I say yes?" he smiled. "Then you'll have to come to Brighton and see it for yourself." The thought lingered after he left. I stood on the porch long after sunset, watching the sky dissolve into deeper blues. For the first time, I didn't feel the weight of decision pressing on me. Whether I went or not didn't matter. The point was that I could. When I finally went inside, Marta was waiting at the counter with a glass of sherry. "You had a visitor," she said. "I did. He looked like trouble." "Only the kind you choose," I said. "Well," she replied, pouring a second glass, That's the best kind there is. We drank in companionable quiet. When I went up to bed, I took Samuel's photograph from the nightstand and held it to the lamplight. The sea in it looked different now, less lonely, more alive. Maybe the difference wasn't in the water, but in me. That night, I dreamed of the window seat again, but this time the train wasn't leaving anywhere. It was circling, infinite, through fields and towns I'd never seen. Beside me, the seat was empty, but it no longer felt like absence. It felt like invitation. The letterbox clattered just after breakfast, that metallic rattle that always seemed louder in quiet places. Marta was in the kitchen humming an old tune, something with no real melody, when I bent to pick it up. It wasn't a letter this time. It was a telegram, the kind no one sends anymore unless they have something urgent or something tender they don't know how to say aloud. The paper was thin, yellowed around the edges, and my name was typed neatly at the top. Mrs. H. Rowe, Willow and Wren, Edenbridge, exhibition confirmed, opening night, July 4th. Your window a centerpiece, would like you there. Train leaves noon Friday. Ticket waiting at counter. S. I stared at it long enough for the print to fade slightly in my vision. Your window, a centerpiece. The words carried a strange weight, as if that photograph had taken on a life I hadn't intended to give it. Marta appeared behind me, wiping her hands on a towel. News? A telegram, I said, handing it to her.
She read it, whistled low. A man sending telegrams these days? That's romance or trouble. Or both. Will you go? I don't know. Then it's already decided, she said. People who truly don't want to go never say I don't know. They say absolutely not. All morning, I tried to settle into my usual routine. Tea, notebook, a walk to the square. But everything around me seemed slightly out of tune, like a song played just a half step too high. The world hummed with the suggestion of departure. Arthur was in his shop when I passed by, perched on his stool behind the counter, glasses fogged with steam from his mug. You look like a woman arguing with a calendar, he said. I've been invited to Brighton. Ah, seaside towns, overrated for swimming, underrated for epiphanies. He poured more tea into my cup from the pot he kept on the desk. So will you go? I haven't decided. He looked at me over the rim of his cup. Then you're afraid. Which is fine. We all are, in one direction or another. Question is, are you afraid of going or afraid of staying? I didn't answer him, and he didn't press. That was one of Arthur's gifts, knowing when silence was the only true form of listening. Back at the inn, I found Nora sitting on the porch knitting something green and shapeless. She looked up as I approached. You're leaving again, she said, as if reading it straight from my face. Maybe. Good. Nothing grows in soil that never gets turned. She set down her knitting and patted the chair beside her. You know, she said, when my husband died, people kept saying I was strong. But what they really meant was that I hadn't moved. I sat in that same chair for 2 years thinking I was honoring him. Truth was, I was just afraid the world would go on without me. And did it? Oh, yes, she said with a small laugh, but it was kind enough to wait until I caught up. That night, I didn't write. I packed. Not much. A single bag, a dress, a cardigan, my notebook, the photograph, and Samuel's blue journal. I slipped the postcard I'd bought from the market inside its pages. The weather is merciful. Wish you were here, but maybe you are. It felt right. The train would leave the next day at noon. I didn't tell anyone except Marta, who left a sandwich wrapped in wax paper by the door that morning with a note, for the road. Because courage needs lunch too. The station at Edenbridge looked smaller than I remembered. A single platform, a wooden bench, a clock that ran 2 minutes slow. The air carried that sweet metallic scent that only train stations have, the smell of movement and possibility. When the train arrived, I climbed aboard and found my seat by the window. The ticket envelope had Samuel's handwriting on it, his letters long, deliberate, as though each one had been earned. Inside was the ticket, and beneath it, a folded slip of paper that simply said, "Sometimes arrival is just another way of beginning again." The train lurched forward. The fields began to blur into motion. My reflection trembled in the window, older, softer, perhaps a little braver. I thought of Jody then, of her letter. I wasn't angry anymore. Pity had replaced it. Not for her, but for the version of myself who once needed permission to exist in other people's plans. She had built her life on logistics. I was building mine on direction. They are not the same thing.
The train reached Brighton just past 4. The air smelled of salt and hot stone, the gulls loud and unashamed overhead. The city felt alive in a way Edenbridge never had. Not better, just louder, more impatient. I walked from the station toward the gallery printed on the telegram, the Shoreline Collective. Inside, the air was cool and smelled faintly of varnish and paper. The walls were white, the kind of white that forces you to confront yourself. Samuel was there, standing beside a cluster of photographs. He turned when he saw me, surprise softening into something warmer. "You came?" "I did." I wasn't sure. Neither was I. He gestured toward the wall. There it was, my window. The photograph was larger than I'd expected, the size of a door. My reflection sat faintly in the glass, the sea stretching behind it in endless silver-gray motion. There was no caption, just a small plaque that read, "Window Seat." People stood in front of it quiet. Some tilted their heads, trying to read emotion into the faint outline of my face. Others simply looked. It was strange seeing myself there, not as a person, but as an image, a moment frozen before it realized it mattered. Samuel came to stand beside me. "It's the only one no one walks away from quickly," he said. "They look at it longer than the rest. Maybe because it feels like waiting. Or because they think they know her," I said. "Do they?" I smiled. "I'm still finding out." After the opening, we walked down to the pier. The sun was setting, the sky melting into colors that didn't bother to stay in their lines. The sea smelled of iron and memory. "Do you ever regret leaving journalism?" I asked. He shook his head. Words were too loud. I wanted quiet. "You taught me that quiet doesn't mean nothing." "And what about you?" he asked after a pause. "Do you regret taking the train?" "No," I said, watching the tide pull against the shore. It was the first thing I did for myself in years that didn't need explaining. We stood there a long time saying nothing. The pier lights blinked on, one by one, like a constellation learning how to exist. When we finally turned back, he said, "I'm leaving again soon, south of France this time. Another series. Come with me." I didn't answer right away. The air between us felt alive with possibility and danger in equal measure. "I'll think about it," I said. "Good," he replied. "Thinking is the beginning of yes." That night I stayed in a small seaside inn. The waves crashed against the shore outside my window, steady and unending. I opened my notebook and wrote only one line before turning out the light. "I have stopped asking where I belong. The world feels smaller when you do." The morning light in Brighton was bold, not like the soft, apologetic kind that crept into my room at Edenbridge. This light barged in, alive with salt and chatter, daring you to face yourself in it. From my window I could see the pier, skeletal and defiant against the sea, and beyond it, the slow awakening of a city that had forgotten how to sleep. I made tea with the small kettle on the dresser and watched the world open. The streets below were already stirring. A boy dragging a crate of oranges, 2 women arguing amiably over the price of flowers, a man sweeping the front of his shop with the kind of devotion people usually reserve for prayer. Samuel had said, "South of France." He had said it the way people say future, and though the words sounded light, I felt the weight of them. Leaving again, starting again. The world was asking whether I still had it in me to move. After breakfast, I walked down to the pier. The boards were slick with morning mist. I leaned against the railing, looking out over the water that had once terrified me with its indifference. It looked different now, not smaller, but less like a boundary. I took out my notebook and wrote, "Sometimes life gives you 2 good doors and no guarantees." The gulls wheeled overhead, their cries sharp against the hush of the tide. Behind me, the city was a hum of engines and footsteps and someone tuning a guitar. "Thought I might find you here." I turned. Samuel stood a few paces away, his hands in his coat pockets, hair tousled by the wind. He looked both older and younger in the morning light, the kind of man who carried the weather with him. "You left the gallery early last night," he said. "Crowds make me nervous." "They make everyone nervous. The difference is whether we pretend they don't." I didn't see the point in pretending. He smiled faintly, stepping closer. "You looked at the photograph for a long time." "I wasn't looking at me," I said. "I was looking at who I used to be." "And?" "She looked tired." He nodded. "You don't anymore." We walked the length of the pier in slow conversation, the kind that drifted between topics without needing to arrive anywhere. He spoke of light, how it behaved differently across coastlines, how he chased it like an old debt. I spoke of stillness, how rare it was to find a silence that didn't feel like punishment. When we reached the end of the pier, he stopped. "I meant what I said last night. Come with me." "Why me?" I asked. "Because you see things the way I try to photograph them, not for what they are, but for what they're becoming. And when the light changes, then we follow it." The wind picked up, teasing my scarf loose. I looked out at the water, the horizon stretching clean and merciless. I thought of Edenbridge, of Nora's knitting, of Marta's tea, of Arthur's patience. I thought of my quiet room with its lace curtains and the notebook that still smelled faintly of lavender. It was an adventure, but it was peace. And yet, peace too can become a kind of cage if you never test the door. "I don't belong in your photographs," I said. He looked at me with that same calm gravity he had on the ferry. "Maybe not, but you belong in your own story, and maybe this next chapter isn't written in Edenbridge." We sat for a while after that, neither convincing the other, just letting the idea hang in the salt air. When he finally stood, he said, "I'll be at the station tomorrow morning, platform 4. If you're there, I'll take it as a yes. If not—" He paused, smiled gently. "Then I'll see you in some other kind of photograph." And then he walked away. No flourish, no backward glance, just the sound of his shoes fading into the clatter of the boardwalk. That evening, I wandered through Brighton as if testing how it felt to be unanchored again. The streets glowed under the golden spill of street lamps. I bought fish and chips from a stall and ate them sitting on a stone wall, the paper growing translucent with grease. I thought of Paul then, my husband, how he would have laughed at the sight of me, hair windblown, salt on my lips, eating dinner from paper like a teenager. I could almost hear his voice. "Finally living a little, are you?" "Yes," I whispered to the air. "Finally." I walked back to the inn under a pale moon and found a letter waiting at the front desk. The envelope was familiar, the same careful handwriting as before. "Jody, Mum, the photos came out lovely. You look so happy. It's good to see you out in the world again. I don't know if you'll even get this, but I hope wherever you are, you're safe. P.S. Emily keeps asking about you. She says next time she wants to take the train with you." I folded the letter carefully and placed it inside the red notebook. It didn't hurt, not this time. The ache had changed shape, from loss to gratitude. She hadn't meant to understand, but she was beginning to. That night I didn't sleep much. I sat by the window, watching the lights along the pier flicker in and out like a heartbeat. The world beyond it was wide and waiting. My bag sat half-packed on the chair. I didn't know what I would decide until morning, to leave again or to stay. Both were brave in their own ways. But sometimes courage isn't a choice. It's the act of standing at the threshold and admitting you could do either. The world was still dark when I woke, the kind of blue-black that holds its breath before morning. The clock on the nightstand read 5:30. My bag sat ready on the chair, the straps coiled neatly like a held-in question. I could hear the sea outside, restless and ancient, pulling and releasing the shore with the rhythm of an old, patient argument. For a long while I stayed in bed, listening to that sound. It was the same sound I'd heard from the ferry, from the cliffs, from every window I'd sat beside since leaving home. The sea had become a kind of metronome for my life, reminding me that movement and return were the same gesture, just in different directions. I made tea, sipped it slowly, and stared at the bag. "You're absurd," I told it quietly. "You're just fabric and zippers, and yet you think you can hold a decision." Outside, Brighton was waking. Seagulls called to no one in particular, delivery trucks sighed down narrow lanes, and the world started to smell faintly of coffee and newsprint. I dressed deliberately, not in the navy dress I'd worn the day I left home, nor in anything new. Just something simple, my soft gray sweater, the scarf with blue flowers, my comfortable shoes. I wanted to look like a woman who could belong anywhere. The station was already alive by the time I arrived. People moved like currents, all different, all sure of their direction, the smell of diesel, the echo of announcements, the brief intimacy of strangers brushing past one another. Platform 4. The sign hung overhead like a sentence waiting for its last word. I stood by the ticket gate, hands tucked into my sleeves, watching the departures board flicker to life. Paris, Dover, south of France. The names glowed like invitations written in another language. Samuel stood further down the platform, camera bag at his feet, coat collar turned up against the wind. He saw me before I moved and smiled. Not the wide, cinematic smile of expectation, but a quiet one, the kind that says I'll understand either way. For a moment I stayed where I was. My body knew the weight of stillness better than it knew the shape of running. And yet something inside me, something soft and newly defiant, tilted forward, like a tree bending toward light. I walked toward him. "Morning," he said. His voice was low, unhurried. "Morning," I answered. "You didn't have to come. I know. But you did." I wasn't sure what I'd decide until just now. He nodded, glancing at the approaching train. The sound of it filled the air, the long metallic sigh of something too heavy to stop once it's begun. He picked up his camera bag and said, "You'll hate the train food. Too dry." "I'm used to it. And the air will be thick and the people louder than necessary." "Good," I said. "I've been too quiet lately." The whistle blew. Doors opened. Passengers began to board, their lives folding neatly into the narrow aisles. "Are you sure?" he asked. "No," I said, stepping onto the train, "but that's why it feels right." We sat by the window, as we always seemed to. The train jerked once, then began to move, slow at first, then steady. Brighton blurred into color and glass, the pier shrinking until it looked like something imagined. For a while, we said nothing. The silence was generous, shared. He took a photograph of the window, the reflection of my hands folded in my lap. "You always look like you're about to say something," he said. "Maybe I am. Maybe I've just been learning when not to." Outside, the landscape rolled open, Fields, hedges, rivers that caught the light and held it for a moment before letting it go. I could see our reflections in the glass, two people who had both stopped waiting for permission. At a small station, the train paused. A girl boarded with a suitcase nearly her size. She sat across the aisle, fumbling with a map, her nervousness loud in the way she clutched her ticket. I smiled at her. "First time traveling alone?" I asked. She nodded. "Yes." "Good," I said. "Don't listen when people tell you to stay put. The world gets smaller if you do." She smiled shyly. I realized with a jolt of gentle irony that I'd become the kind of woman I used to imagine meeting when I was young, the one who said things that made you believe bravery was simply the ability to buy a ticket and sit by the window. Hours later, the train crossed into France. The coast appeared, gold and gray, under the slant of the afternoon sun. The fields looked unfamiliar, but not unkind. Samuel leaned his head back against the seat. "You don't look afraid," he said. "I'm not," I replied. I finally stopped mistaking safety for happiness. He smiled, closing his eyes. "Then maybe this isn't running away anymore." "No," I said softly, watching the light slide across the glass. "Maybe this is what arriving looks like." That evening, as the train followed the shoreline, the sea returned to view, vast, unbroken, shimmering under the low sun. I rested my forehead against the window. The motion of the train felt like breathing, the rhythm of something alive and certain. I thought of Edenbridge, the inn, the bookshop, Nora's fox-stitched cardigan. They would miss me, yes, but they would also understand. Staying there had taught me stillness. Leaving again was teaching me motion. Both were forms of peace. I pulled my notebook from my bag, opened to the first blank page, and wrote, "The window isn't a barrier, it's a mirror that moves. Every journey is a second chance at belonging, not to a place, but to yourself." The words sat clean and final on the page. For once I didn't feel the need to edit them. Outside, the train curved along the coast. The sun melted into the sea, and for a brief, impossible moment, it looked as if the whole world were on fire. I smiled, not because I had reached somewhere, but because I finally knew I didn't have to. The air in the south of France was different. It didn't move, it shimmered. Heat hung over the coast like a veil, turning even the simplest things, a linen curtain, a chipped mug, a ripple in the bay, into small miracles. The light was so golden it almost hurt to look at. You didn't walk through it. You waded the way one moves through memory.
We rented a small house overlooking the sea. Whitewashed walls, blue shutters, an olive tree out front that leaned toward the water as if it had been waiting centuries for someone to listen. The air smelled of salt and citrus and the faint hum of distant bees. The locals called the place Saint-Clair-des-Vents, St. Clair of the Winds, a village so small that the bakery doubled as a post office and everyone greeted you by name after 3 days. "This'll do," Samuel said when we first arrived, setting down his camera bag. "It's not much," I replied. "It's everything," he said. And he was right. The days slipped by in that honey-colored way summer days do, quietly, without apology. Samuel spent mornings photographing fishermen along the harbor, the creases in their faces deep as folded maps. I sat by the window, writing. Not about him, or the sea, or even myself. I wrote about the small things that refused to stay still. The hum of a fly against the glass, the smell of wet stone after rain, the laughter of 2 children chasing a red kite along the sand. In the afternoons, we'd walk. Sometimes to the market, sometimes to nowhere at all. He'd carry his camera and I'd carry a notebook, each of us trying to trap time in our own ways. "You still write every day?" he asked once. "Yes," I said. "About what?" "About today." "That's brave," he said. "Most people spend their lives writing about yesterday." Evenings were for quiet, We'd sit by the open window with a bottle of cheap red wine, watching the sea dissolve into color. The light here didn't fade. It surrendered. The sky softened into bruised purples, and the kind of blue that painters go mad trying to name. Sometimes Samuel would talk about his work, the next project, the next place. Other times we said nothing at all, content to let the silence earn its keep. One night, he showed me a photograph he'd taken, not of the sea, not of strangers, but of me, sitting at the window, sunlight across my hands. "I didn't know you took this," I said. "You were looking out, but it looked like you were looking in." I studied the image. I looked older, yes, but also lighter. The lines on my face didn't bother me anymore. They felt like the rings of a tree. Proof that I'd stood through all kinds of weather. "It's strange," I said. "I thought I was running away from everything." "You weren't," he said softly. "You were just finally facing the right direction." Weeks passed. Then one morning a letter arrived, postmarked from England. The handwriting was small, careful, a little smudged in places. "Grandma, Mum showed me your picture in the paper. You looked happy. Can I come visit you one day? I want to sit by the window too. Love, Emily." I read it 3 times. The paper trembled slightly in my hands, though whether from age or emotion I couldn't tell. Samuel looked up from his camera. "Bad news?" "The opposite," I said. "It's an invitation." He smiled. "Then we should make room." That afternoon, I went down to the harbor and bought a small wooden chair from a fisherman's wife. Paint peeling, one leg uneven. I carried it back up the hill and placed it by the window beside mine. It looked absurd at first. Too small, too hopeful, but it made me smile. For the first time, I realized I wasn't waiting for anyone to arrive. I was simply preparing the space for when they did. The next morning, Samuel left early to photograph the sunrise. I stayed behind, making tea, watching light creep across the wall. The air was warm already, the world humming with quiet promise. I opened my notebook, the red one Arthur had given me, and wrote, "The trick isn't to keep moving. It's to keep noticing. I've learned that windows don't separate us from the world. They remind us we're still part of it." I closed the book, set it on the sill, and watched the sea for a long time. The tide came in slow, steady, faithful. Somewhere in that rhythm, I felt it. The quiet understanding that this was not an ending, not even a destination. It was simply another window, another view. Later that evening, Samuel returned, his camera heavy with light. He placed a photograph on the table, the sunrise over the water, gold spilling into blue. Beneath it, he'd written one line, "You taught me that stillness can travel too." We didn't need to speak after that.
The world had gone gentle, and for once so had we. The sea murmured below, the olive leaves shimmered in the last of the sun, and through the window, the first window that had ever truly felt like home, I saw the reflection of a woman who had finally arrived where she was always meant to be, not in a place but in herself. Epilogue. Window seat. Months later, visitors to the Shoreline Collective in Brighton would stop before a new photograph. 2 chairs by a window, one empty, one occupied, sunlight across their backs. The plaque read only this: "The window seat, final frame." Photograph by S. Hale. Text by H. Rowe. And though no one could say for sure where it was taken, everyone who stood before it swore they could hear the faint sound of waves and the quiet laughter of someone who had, at long last, decided to stay.